Evolution. This chapter belongs to Darwin. Not that his writings, which are cited under almost all headings, stand alone in the various places they appear. The point is rather that many of the topics are dictated by and draw their meaning from his thought, and that he figures in all the major issues connected with the origin of species. The theory of evolution and the place of man in the order of nature. With respect to the matters under consideration in this chapter, the other writings in the tradition of the great books cannot escape from being classified as coming before or after Darwin, or as being with or against him. Darwin's influence on later writers may be variously estimated, but it is plainly remarked by their use of his language and their reference to his fundamental notions. James's Principles of Psychology, especially in its chapters on instinct and emotion, views the behavior of men and animals and the phenomena of intelligence or mind in evolutionary terms. The writings of Freud are similarly dominated by the genetic approach and by an appeal to man's animal ancestry. In order to explain the inherited constitution of his psyche in conformity with the doctrine of evolution. Outside psychology, the concept of evolution is reflected in theories of progress or of a dialectical development in history. As, for example, in the outside psychology, the concept of evolution is reflected in theories of progress or of dialectical development in history, as, for example, in the dialectical or historical materialism of Marx and Engels, which is set forth in the latter's Dialectics of Nature, an even more general reorientation of philosophy, which stems from an evolutionary way of thinking, is to be found in the writings of Bergson and Dewey, such as Creative Evolution and the Influence of Darwin on Philosophy. These, along with many of the specifically biological works cited in the list of additional readings, gives some measure of the influence of Darwin not only on philosophical thought, but also on the direction of research in all the biological sciences. With regard to Darwin's predecessors, the question is not so much one of their influence upon him as of their anticipation in one way or another of his discoveries, his conceptions, and his theory. The observation made in antiquity concerning hillside deposit of marine fossils is sometimes taken as implying an early recognition of the evolution of terrestrial life. More apposite, perhaps, is the statement by Lucretius that the new earth first put forth grass and bushes, and next gave birth to the races of mortal creatures, springing up, many in number, in many ways, after divers fashions. Lucretius also speaks of strange monsters which nature did not permit to survive. Nature set a ban on their increase, and they could not reach the covered flower of age, nor find food, nor be united in marriage. And many races of living things must have then died out and been unable to beget and continue their breed. Those which survived, he adds, had qualities which protected and preserved each particular race. Apparently susceptible to similar interpretation are Aristotle's statements that nature proceeds little by little from things lifeless to animal life, that there is observed in plants a continuous scale of ascent toward the animal, and that throughout the entire animal scale there is a graduated differentiation in amount of vitality and in capacity for motion. Augustine's commentary on the first chapter of Genesis seems even more explicitly to contemplate the successive appearance of the various forms of life. Plants and animals did not actually exist when the world began, though their causes were created by God and existed from the beginning. The actual production of plants and animals in their various kinds is, as Aquinas tells us while summarizing Augustine's view, the work of propagation, not of creation. Like Aristotle, both Aquinas and Locke represent the world of living organisms as a graduated scale, ascending from less to more perfect forms of life. But where Aquinas tends to conceive that graduated scale as a hierarchy involving essential differences, Locke sees an almost perfect continuity involving only differences in degree. In all the visible world, he writes, we see no chasms or gaps. To illustrate this, he points out that there are fishes that have wings and are not strangers to the airy region. And there are some birds that are inhabitants of the water, whose blood is cold as fishes. There are animals so near of kin to both birds and beasts that they are in the middle between both. Amphibious animals link the terrestrial and aquatic together, and the animal and vegetable kingdoms are so nearly joined that if you will take the lowest of one and the highest of the other, there will scarce be perceived any great difference between them. And so on till we come to the lowest and the most inorganical parts of matter. We shall find everywhere that the several species are linked together and differ but in almost insensible degrees. But for the theory of evolution, the observation of a hierarchy in nature, or even of a continuity in which the species differ by almost insensible degrees, constitutes only background. What the theory of evolution brings to the fore is the notion of a developmental or genetic relation among the various forms of life, because it seems to contain this insight. The anticipation of Darwin, to be found in Kant's Critique of Judgment, is perhaps the most remarkable, even though in a closely related passage in which Kant discusses epigenesis, he uses the word evolution in a sense quite contrary to Darwin's conception. It is praiseworthy, Kant writes, to employ a comparative anatomy and go through the vast creation of organized beings in order to see if they are if there is not discoverable in it some trace of a system, and indeed of a system following a genetic principle. When we consider the agreement of so many genera of animals in certain common schema, which apparently underlies not only the structure of their bones, but also the disposition of their remaining parts, and when we find here the wonderful simplicity of the original plan, which has been able to produce such an immense variety of species by the shortening of one member and the lengthening of another, by the involution of this part and the evolution of that part, there gleams upon the mind a ray of hope, however faint, that the principle of the mechanism of nature, apart from which there can be no natural science at all, may yet enable us to arrive at some explanation in the case of organic life. This analogy of forms, which in all their differences seem to be produced in accordance with a common type, strengthens the suspicion that they have an actual kinship due to descent from a common parent. This we might trace to the gradual approximation of one animal species to another, from that in which the principle of ends seems best authenticated, namely from man back to the polyp, and from this back even to mosses and lichens, and finally to the lowest perceivable stage of nature. Finding anticipations of Darwin involves judgments much more subject to controversy than tracing his influences. It is questionable, for example, whether the suggestive passages in Lucretius and Locke bear more than a superficial resemblance to Darwin's thought. The matter is further complicated by Darwin's own sense of his divergence from and disagreement with his predecessors, both immediate precursors like Buffon and Linnaeus, and earlier philosophers and theologians. Darwin tells us himself of his quarrel with the theologians. His followers elaborate on the opposition between his conception of species and that of Aristotle, an opposition which Darwin intimates by the great stress he lays on the difference between a static taxonomy and a dynamic or genealogical classification of living things. We must therefore try to locate the central point of Darwin's theory in order to judge comparable views for their agreement or disagreement. As the title of his major work indicates, it is not evolution as a grand scheme of biological or cosmic history, but the origin of species, with which Darwin seems to be principally concerned. He is concerned with establishing the fact that new species do originate in the course of time, against those who suppose the species of living things to be fixed in number and immutable in type throughout the ages. He is concerned with describing the circumstances under which new species arise and other forms cease to have the status of species or become extinct. He is concerned with formulating the various factors in the differentiation of species, and with showing against those who think a new species requires a special act of creation, and the origin of species, like their extinction, is entirely a natural process which requires no factors other than those at work every day in the life, death, and breeding of plants and animals. Only as a consequence of these primary considerations does he engage in speculations about the moving panorama of life on Earth, from its beginnings to its present and its future. Darwin looks upon the term species as arbitrarily given, and from that reason does not attempt any strict definition of it. He uses it, moreover, like his predecessors, in systematic biological classification, to signify a set of individuals closely resembling each other, a class of plants or animals having certain common characteristics. Darwin would probably agree with Locke's criticism of those who suppose that our definitions of species grasp the real essences or relate to the substantial forms inherent in things, as indicated in the chapter on definition. Locke insists that our notion of species expresses only what he calls the nominal essence, a set of characteristics we attach to the name we give things of a sort when we group them and separate them in our classifications. The boundaries of species whereby man sorts things are made by men. He writes, the essence of the species distinguished by different names are of man's making. Species is not the only term of classification. A genus, for example, is a more inclusive group than a species. Groups which differ specifically belong to the same genus, and if their difference is accompanied by the possession of common traits. As species differ from one another within a generic group, so genera are in turn subclasses of more inclusive groupings, such as phyla, families, and orders. But there are also smaller groupings within a species. There are races or varieties and subvarieties, the members of which share the characteristics of the species but differ from one another in other respects. Ultimately, of course, within the smallest class, the systematist bothers to define each individual differs from every other in the same group with whom at the same time it shares certain characteristics of the race, the species, the genus, and all the larger classes to which they belong. This general plan of botanical or zoological classification does not seem to give species peculiar status in the hierarchy of classes or groupings, or to distinguish it from other classes, except as these are more or less inclusive than itself. Why then should attention be focused on the origin of species rather than of varieties or of genera? One part of the answer comes from the facts of generation or reproduction. Offspring tend to differ from their parents as well as from each other, but they also tend to resemble one another. A given germ, Aristotle writes, does not give rise to any chance living being, nor spring from any chance one. But each germ springs from a definite parent and gives rise to a definite progeny. This is an early formulation of the insight that in the process of reproduction, the law of like generating like always holds for those characteristics which identify the species of ancestors and progeny. In other words, a species always breeds true. Its members always generate organisms which can be classified as belonging to the same species. However, much they vary among themselves as individuals within the group. Furthermore, the subgroups, the races or varieties of a species, are able to breed with one another, but diverse species cannot interbreed. Organisms different in species either cannot mate productively at all, or if crossbred, like the horse and the ass, they produce a sterile hybrid, like the mule. In the hierarchy of classes, then, species would seem to be distinguished from all smaller groupings by their stability, from generation to generation. If species are thus self-perpetuating, they in turn give stability to all the larger groupings, the genera, phyla, families, which remain as fixed from generation to generation as the species which constitute them. Hence, the question of origin applies peculiarly to species rather than to varieties or to genera. On the supposition stated, no origin of species would seem to be possible except by a special act of creation. Either all the existing species of organisms have always existed from the beginning of life on Earth, or, if in the course of ages new species have arisen, their appearance cannot be accounted for by natural generation. By the law of natural generation, offspring will always be of the same species as the parent organisms. Spontaneous generation, of course, remains a possibility. A new species of organism might come to be without being generated by other living organisms. But apart from the question of fact, i.e., whether spontaneous generation ever does occur, such origin of a form of life seems to lie outside the operation of natural senses and to imply the intervention of supernatural power. The possibility of spontaneous generation was entertained in antiquity and the Middle Ages, and was even thought to be supported by observation, such as that of maggots emerging from putrefying matter. But modern science tends to affirm the biogenetic law that living organisms are generated only by living organisms. To Kant, the notion that life could have sprung up from the nature of what is void of life seems not only contrary to fact, but absurd or unreasonable. Yet, while affirming the principle that like produces like by insisting upon the generation of something organic from something else that is also organic, Kant does not carry that principle to the point where it would make the generation of a new species impossible. Within the class of organic beings, he writes, it is possible for one organism to generate another differing specifically from it. Against the background of these various suppositions, Darwin is moved to a new insight by the conjunction of certain types of fact, the results of breeding under domestication, which exhibit the great range of variation within a species, and the tendency of inbred varieties to breed true, his own observations of the geographical distribution of species of flora and fauna, especially those separated from one another by impassable barriers. The facts of comparative anatomy and embryology, which reveal affinities in organic structure and development between organisms distinct in species, and the geological record, which indicates the great antiquity of life upon the earth, which gives evidence of the cataclysmic changes in the earth's surface, with consequences for the survival of life. and which above all contains the fossil remains of forms of life now extinct, but not dissimilar from species alive in the present age. Briefly stated, Darwin's insight is that new species arise when, among the varieties of an existing species, certain intermediate forms become extinct, and the other circumstances are such that the surviving varieties now become more sharply separated from one another in type, are able to reproduce their kind, and in the course of many generations of inbreeding also tend to breed true. They thus perpetuate their type until each in turn ceases to be a species and becomes a genus, when its own extreme varieties, separated by the extinction of intermediates, become new species as they themselves did at an earlier stage of history. For the very same reason that Darwin says a well-marked variety may be called an incipient species. A species may be called an incipient genus. The point is misunderstood if it is supposed that when new species originate from old, both the new and the old continue to survive as species. On the contrary, when in the course of thousands of generations some of the varieties of species achieve the status of species, the species from which they originated by variation ceases to be a species and becomes a genus. The only distinction between species and well-marked varieties, Darwin writes, is that the latter are known or believed to be connected at the present day with intermediate gradations, whereas species were formerly thus connected. It is quite possible that forms now generally acknowledged to be merely varieties may hereafter be thought worthy of specific names, and in this case scientific and common language will come into accordance. In short, we shall have to treat species in the same manner as those naturalists treat genera, who admit that genera are merely artificial combinations made for convenience. Our classifications will come to be, as far as they can be so made, genealogies. The origin of species thus seems to be identical with the extinction of intermediate varieties, combined with the survival of one or more of the extreme varieties. These seem to be simply two ways of looking at the same thing. Still, another way of seeing the point may be achieved by supposing, contrary to fact, the survival of all the varieties ever produced through the breeding of organisms. If my theory be true, Darwin writes, numberless intermediate varieties linking closely together all the species of the same group must assuredly have existed. But the very process of natural selection constantly tends, as has been so often remarked, to exterminate the parent forms and the intermediate links. If one were to suppose the simultaneous coexistence of all intermediate varieties in the present day, the groups now called species would be continuously connected by slight differences among their members, and would not, therefore, be divided into distinct species, as they now are because certain links are missing. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant states the principle of continuity in the following manner. This principle, he writes, indicates that all differences of species limit each other and do not admit of transition from one to another by a saltus, but only through smaller degrees of the difference between the one species and the other. In one word, there are no species or subspecies which are the nearest possible to each other. Intermediate species or subspecies being always possible, the difference of which from each of the former is always smaller than the difference existing between these. But Kant adds, it is plain that this continuity of forms is a mere idea to which no adequate object can be discovered in experience, partly because the species in nature are really divided, and if the gradual progression through their affinity were continuous, the intermediate members lying between two given species must be infinite in number, which is impossible. The Russian geneticist Theodore Dobzhansky gives an interpretation of continuity in nature which differs from Kant's in that it follows and applies Darwin's conception of species and their origin. According to him, if we suppose the extreme case of all possible genetic variations being alive on Earth together, the result would be not an infinite number of species, but no species in genera at all. The array of plants and animals would approach a perfectly continuous series in which there would only be individual differences. There would be no specific or generic groupings of the sort now made in our classification of the forms of life. On Darwin's conception of the origin of species, its causes divide into two sets of factors. First, those which determine the extinction or survival of organisms, and with their survival, their opportunities for mating and reproduction. Second, those which determine the transmission of characteristics from one generation to another, and the variation of offspring from their ancestors and from each other. Without genetic variation, there would be no range of differences within a group on which the factors of selection could operate. Without the inheritance of ancestral traits, there would be no perpetuation of group characteristics in the organisms which manage to survive and reproduce. For Darwin, the operation of the first set of factors constitutes the process of natural selection. This may take place in many ways through geological catastrophes, which make certain areas of the Earth's surface uninhabitable for all organisms, or for those type which cannot adapt themselves to the radically changed environment, through the competition among organisms for the limited food supply available in their habitat, through the struggle for existence in which organisms not only compete for food but also prey upon one another, through the sexual selection which operates within a group when some organisms are prevented by others from mating and reproducing, and through all the obstacles which isolate groups from interbreeding, including geographical and physiological inaccessibility. The struggle for existence is not only a struggle to survive, but also a struggle to reproduce. Natural selection operates with respect to reproduction as well as survival. Whether the survival is of the fittest alone, or whether the multiplication of inferior organisms also gives evolution another direction, has been disputed since Darwin's day. But according to his theory, natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being. All corporeal and mental endowments will tend to progress toward perfection. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the production of the higher animals directly follows. With respect to the factors of heredity and variation, tremendous advances since Darwin in the experimental science of genetics requires revisions in the parts of his theory of evolution. This is particularly true of the researches of Mendel, Bateson, and Morgan concerning the ways in which genetic factors operate. But on one major point in the theory of heredity, Darwin holds a view which later investigations have tended to confirm. Attedating Weismann, he nevertheless opposes Lamarck's theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, as William James expresses it, where Lamarck supposes that environmental influences cause changes in the structure or functioning of the organism, which then became hereditary. Darwin regards the environment merely as a selective agency, acting upon variations produced entirely by causes operating in the breeding process. James thinks the evidence for Mr. Darwin's view was quite convincing, even before it received the support of Weismann's theory, according to which it is a priori impossible that any peculiarity acquired during the lifetime by the parent should be transmitted to the germ. The situation is not the same with regard to Darwin's views on the mechanism of heredity. Writing before Mendel's classic experiments in hybridization, Darwin seems to suppose a blending of hereditary factors, whereas, according to Mendel, inheritance is particulate. Distinct genetic factors combine to produce a certain somatic result without losing their separate identities. They can therefore be reassorted and enter into new genetic combinations in the next generation. Most important of all, Darwin thinks that new forms of life arise gradually as the result of a continuous accumulation of slight and imperceptible variations. The opposite view is now taken, the discovery of abrupt mutations in a single generation discountenances Darwin's maxim, natura non facit saltum, nature does nothing by jumps. These advances in genetics since Darwin's day do not alter the main outlines of his theory. The mechanisms of heredity may be much more complicated than Darwin knew, and involve much of which he was ignorant, such as mutation rates, or the various types, causes, and effects of hybridization. But that merely leads to a more elaborate or different explanation of genetic variation in offspring and the transmission of ancestral traits. No matter how these are explained, their occurrence is all that is needed to permit new species to originate through natural processes of heredity and selection. If Darwin were alive today, Julian Huxley writes, the title of his book would have to be not The Origin, but The Origins of Species. For perhaps the most salient single fact that has emerged from recent studies is that species may arise in a number of quite distinct ways. The reader must judge for himself to what extent Darwin's theory of evolution was anticipated by those who, like Augustine, affirm the appearance of new species of life on Earth at various stages in its history, or even by a writer like Kant, who seems to possess the germ of its insight. The critical test in every case is whether those who affirm the occurrence of new species by natural processes rather than by special creation think of them as simply added to the organic forms already in existence without any change in the status as species of the pre-existing forms. Those who think in this way do not have Darwin's idea of the origin of species, for in conceiving an increase in the number of species as merely a matter of addition, they necessarily attribute stability to each species, new as well as old. By this test, not even Kant seems to be near the center of Darwin's hypothesis of the origin of species by the extinction of intermediate varieties. In comparing Darwin with certain of his predecessors, notably Aristotle and Aquinas, it seems necessary to apply another kind of test. Here, the problem is not so much one of discovering affinities or disagreements as one of determining whether they are talking about the same thing and therefore when they appear to disagree whether the issue between them is genuine. They do not seem to conceive a species in the same way. Certainly, they use the word differently. This affects the way in which the whole problem of origins is understood. The controversies concerning the fixity or mutability of species, concerning evolution and creation, and concerning the origin of man, involve genuine issues only if those who seem to disagree do not use the word species in widely different senses. It is possible that certain forms of life do not originate by descent from a common ancestor and do not derive their status as quite distinct types from the mere absence of intermediate varieties which once must have existed but are now extinct. If such forms were to be called species, the word would have a different meaning from the meaning it has when applied to types of pigeons, beetles, or rats. The first of these two meanings may express the philosophical conception of a living species as a class of organisms having the same essential nature, according to which conception there never could have been intermediate varieties. The second meaning may be that of the scientific taxonomist in botany or zoology, who constructs a system of classification, genealogical or otherwise. On this meaning, 1.5 million would be a conservative estimate of the number of plant and animal types classified by the systematist as species. In contrast, the number of species, in the philosophical sense of distinct essences, would be extremely small. Darwin, for example, says, "I cannot doubt that the theory of descent with modification embraces all the members of the same great class or kingdoms. I believe that animals are descended from at most only 4 or 5 progenitors, and plants from an equal or lesser number." Analogy would lead me one step farther, namely to the belief that all animals and plants are descended from some one prototype. But analogy may be a deceitful guide. It is immaterial to the theory of evolution, he adds, whether this inference, chiefly grounded on analogy, be accepted. The issue between Darwin and the theologians may or may not be genuine according to the interpretation of this passage, and according to the possibility of a double use of the word species. For both the smaller number of progenitors from which all the extant types of plants and animals have evolved, and for a very large number of those extant types. If the theologians use the word species in the first sense and Darwin in the second, they need not be in disagreement. The view of life which Darwin attributes to certain eminent authorities he himself does not flatly reject, namely that life, with its several powers, has been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one. Is there common ground here in the admitted possibility that life may have been originally created in a small number of distinct forms, and that these are to be regarded as species in one conception, though not in another? If so, the affirmation of a certain fixity to species would apply only to a few primordial forms. Concerning forms which have appeared with the passage of time, two questions would have to be answered. First, are they species in the philosopher's sense of distinct and immutable essences, or species in the scheme of systemic biological classification? Second, is their first appearance at an historical moment due to a special act of creation, to spontaneous generation, or to evolution from already existing organic forms by descent with modification? To join issue with Darwin, it would seem to be necessary for the person answering these questions to use the word species in the biologist's sense, and at the same time to account for the historical origin of the new species by special creation or spontaneous generation. But in the tradition of the great books, theologians like Augustine and Aquinas do not attribute to God any special act of creation after the original production of the world, except to explain the origin of individual human souls. Nothing entirely new was afterwards made by God, Aquinas writes, but all things subsequently made had in a sense been made before in the work of the 6 days. Some existed not only in matter, but also in their causes, as those individual creatures that are now generated existed in the first of their kind. Species also that are new, if any such appear, existed beforehand in various active powers, so that animals, and perhaps even new species of animals, are produced by putrefaction, by the power which the stars and elements received at the beginning. Again, animals of new kinds arise occasionally from the connection of individuals belonging to different species, as the mule is the offspring of an ass and a mare. But even these existed previously in their causes, in the work of the 6 days. Whether or not the theologian's conception of an historical development of the forms of life conforms to the evolutionist's hypothesis, even though it does not offer the same type of explanation, is a matter which the reader of the texts must decide. But one issue which still remains to be discussed can leave little doubt of a basic controversy between Darwin and some of his predecessors, especially the theologians. It concerns the origin and nature of man. It can be stated in terms of two views of human nature. One is that man is a species in the philosophical sense, essentially and abruptly distinct from brute animals. The other, that man is a species in the biologist's sense, and differs from other animals only by continuous variation. On the first view, either man would have to be created in body as well as soul, or if the human species has an origin which in part or whole involves the operation of natural causes, it must be conceived as emerging from a lower form of life. The rational soul, Aquinas maintains, cannot come to be except by creation. But it is not only man's soul which, according to Aquinas, cannot be produced save immediately by God. He also insists that the first formation of the human body could not be the instrumentality of any created power, but was immediately from God. He does not reject the suggestion of Augustine that the human body may have pre-existed in other creatures, as an effect pre-exists in its causes. But he adds the qualification that it pre-exists in its causes only, in the manner of a passive potentiality, so that it can be produced out of pre-existing matter only by God. A Christian theologian, like Aquinas, might entertain the hypothesis of emergent evolution as applied to the human organism, but only with the qualifications that natural causes by themselves do not suffice for the production of man. On the second view, which is Darwin's man and the anthropoid apes, which is Darwin's man and the anthropoid apes have descended from a common ancestral form which is now extinct, as are also many of the intermediate varieties in the chain of development, unless, as it is sometimes thought, certain fossil remains supply some of the missing links. The great break in the organic chain between man and his nearest allies, which cannot be bridged over by any extinct or living species, has often been advanced. Darwin admits as a grave objection to the belief that man is descended from some lower form, but this objection, he continues, will not appear of much weight to those who, from general reasons, believe in the general principles of evolution. Breaks often occur in all parts of the series, some being wide, sharp, and defined, others less so in various degrees, as between the orang and its nearest allies, between the tarsius and the other Lemuridae, between the elephant and, in a more striking manner, between the Ornithorhynchus, or Echidna, and all other mammals. Furthermore, Darwin insists no one who has read Lyell's Antiquity of Man will lay much stress on the absence of fossil remains, for Lyell has shown that in all the vertebrate classes, the discovery of fossil remains has been a very slow and fortuitous process. Nor should it be forgotten that those regions which are the most likely to afford remains connecting man with some extinct ape-like creature have not as yet been searched by geologists. On either of these two conflicting views, the organic affinities between man and the most highly developed mammals would be equally intelligible, though they would be differently interpreted by Aquinas and Darwin. But according to the doctrine of man's creation by God, or even on the hypothesis of emergent evolution, there need not be, strictly speaking, there cannot be, a missing link between ape and man, for the emergent species is a whole step upward in the scale of life. Man is thus not one of several organic types, which have become species through the extinction of intermediate varieties, and hence he differs from other animals not in an accidental but rather in an essential manner. That is, he differs in kind rather than degree. This issue concerning human nature is discussed from other points of view in the chapters on animals and man. Here, the issue stated in terms of man's origin seems to involve three possibilities: special creation, evolution by descent from a common ancestor, and emergent evolution. But these three possibilities apply not only to man, but to the origin of every species which did not exist at the first moment of life on Earth. The hypothesis of special creation does not seem to be hailed by the theologians, at least not in the tradition of the great books. The hypothesis of emergent evolution raises questions concerning the factors, natural or supernatural, which must be operative to cause the emergence of higher from lower forms of organic matter. Whether or not Aristotle and Aquinas can supply an answer to these questions in terms of their theory of matter's potentiality for a variety of forms, Darwin's theory of descent and modification seems to be definitely opposed to the hypothesis of emergent evolution. Speaking as a Darwinian, James says that the point which, as evolutionists, we are bound to hold fast to is that all the new forms of being that make their appearance are really nothing more than results of the redistribution of the original and unchanging materials. No new natures, no factors not present at the beginning are introduced at any later stage. In this dispute between two theories of evolution, does not the solution depend in every case upon a prior question concerning the relation of the species under consideration, whether or not it is possible for them to be or to have been developmentally connected by intermediate varieties? If, for example, the evidence were to prove that man and ape, as they now exist in the world, are essentially distinct, different in kind, then no intermediate varieties could ever have existed to account for their descent from a common ancestor. If, on the other hand, the evidence were to prove that they differ only in degree, then no difficulty stands in the way of the Darwinian hypothesis. The ultimate issue concerning the origin of species would thus seem to reduce to the problem of which meaning of species applies to the organic type in question. Well, human beings would seem to resemble many of the different species on this planet in a lot of ways. The way our bodies have these different systems: nervous system, blood, bone, skin, eyes, brain, lungs. They all seem to share the same sort of general architecture. Human beings and the animals. We all seem to be bound to living on an Earth environment. Whether or not that means we evolved from the Earth is up for debate. But to me, it seems like that would be a natural, sort of an elegant way to bring things about into creation. You create the world, and then you have the world create life that is sort of meant to exist on the world. Whether or not life needs a Earth-like world to form is also a question. In Star Trek, you have like all kinds of life out there in the galaxy, forming from different substances. But how something like life could form out of something that is evidently inorganic is a question. And they talk about the primordial ooze being struck by lightning or something, which I suppose could like randomly make atoms bounce into each other in such a way where they like start reacting into the form of life. I don't see why not. I mean, the fact anything exists at all is already weird enough. Why is it that, you know, light behaves the way it does? Or sound, or gravity. There's rules for everything. That's the interesting thing about being human is, at least to me, is that you can perceive the sort of elegant and harmonious aspects of the laws that seem to govern reality. Things are predictable because there's rules to existence. You can learn about it. Whether that means there was a God who designed it all is a question for the philosophers. But as far as the origin of species, evolution, I mean, it's a legitimate scientific question. I wonder if, you know, did we form out of the earth? That's not really what the Darwin's writings are about, though. I don't think. It's not about the origin of life. It's about the origin of species. How did things begin to differentiate into distinguished species if they all had the common ancestor? I guess is probably what he explains. Who knows? Maybe life always existed the way the universe may have always existed. It's not what the theologians believe. Believe that there was a beginning. But that now you're getting into whether or not time is in, is something that had a, whether time actually exists or not. I sometimes think that human beings don't have a natural sort of existence in this world, because we're so vulnerable to the elements. We need all these. We need to live in structures to sort of protect ourselves, and I mean, I guess that's kind of true for certain animals as well, but it doesn't seem like we are fit to sort of survive naturally on this planet. Like Bigfoot or something. Maybe Bigfoot was the original intelligent humanoid on this planet, and whatever we are came from somewhere else, took over. But that's like schizo territory. Interesting question, though. I think people are beginning to discover that human beings have existed for a lot longer than we previously thought, or at least human beings with technology and stuff, and civilization. Which then makes you ask the question, well, how come we haven't evolved at all these thousands of years or whatever? Basically the same for millions of years. Maybe once you get to a certain point of intelligence, you stop evolving. Very fast. Sort of like every degree of complexity that you rise to. Like in World of Warcraft, it gets harder to get to the next level. That's an interesting theory. The World of Warcraft leveling theory. They should add that to the origin of species. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the homeless, the homeless on the streets, and the way that they're just like totally ill-equipped to live comfortably in the elements. you sort of see the sad state of man on this planet. Just with no supporting systems. But it's probably mostly because homeless people live in unnatural environments like cities, where their ability to survive is not based on natural attributes, but sort of being able to conform to modern requirements. Surviving in modern times is probably in some ways more complicated, but it's more complicated in that you can't just go hunt an antelope or fish in a pond because some game warden will come arrest you. But simple in that you can just get really good at doing one task over and over and be totally fine. You good at doing one task, and that's basically a job, right? In society, it's just some weird random freaking thing. You get really good at doing it, and then you do that. It fills a purpose. You're a cog in the giant machine. It does one thing, and but you'll get money that you can spend on a variety of things that take care of all your needs. So it simplifies things that way. You only have to be good at like one thing in modern times. Compared to what you'd have to be good at in ancient times to sort of survive. You'd have to be able to do all sorts of things. Probably be a more complete individual in many ways. Less specialization, more generalization.